my sister-in-law. She decides to come with me this year to our annual hiking trip. She doesn't like hiking. She doesn't like bugs. She doesn't like camping. All she cares about is frivolous, expensive items. But she comes along anyways and becomes an absolute annoyance to everybody here, including her brother. So what do? I come up with a genius plan. A genius plan that'll make sure she never messes with me again. But I might have gone too far. Hey there. Before I share my family drama, I'd like to add a little context for the issue at hand. I met my partner, Chris, 6 years ago at college, and we got married after graduation. Sadly, while I do deeply love him, I don't feel that I've necessarily been accepted by his family yet. The sister-in-law in particular has always kept a keen animosity towards me. Normally, this wouldn't be so bad, but trouble closer to home made me distant from my own family, leaving me to rely upon Chris and his family very often. It's because of this that I've previously wished they would finally see me as part of the family. Although, with everything that's happened now, I doubt it. And it was this same sister-in-law that decided to make my life absolutely miserable on this one occasion, attempting to ruin the last sacred tradition my friends and I've managed to keep going. Well, now to get back on track with this crap, there is this thing that really started getting interesting. It started on as an ordinary Thursday afternoon, and by then I'd already mentally checked out from work, while I packed my backpack for the trip ahead. Travel light was never my motto, but at least one big bag is better than lugging around a few smaller ones. Chris was out visiting family this week, but had arranged to meet us at a nearby Walmart parking lot with others. As a tradition that dates back nearly as long as our relationship, Chris and I have been hiking for the first weekend of summer every year with a few friends we made way back when. We've known Mike and Briony since our second year of college, with Mike and Chris sharing classes and Briony being introduced to the group of his girlfriend. We bonded quickly and became close friends, but after finishing college we kinda went our separate ways and found it hard to find time for each other. This is why when Chris initially suggested the trip we were elated. Now, we had a mini holiday just for us, an excuse to get some fresh air while catching up and socializing. Because of this, we've always regarded it as a sacred and private event, keeping it to the tight-knit circle it started with, which is when Chris turned up at the parking lot the next morning with his sister. We were anything but pleased about the tag-along. From the local Walmart parking lot, it took around 2 hours to reach the limits of the national park. While we had our cars, we knew it made more sense to car share for the journey, as Mike, one of the friends of an old minivan, is what he had, and we could all fit into it. Well, just about. Of course, we did not account for my sister-in-law to turn up, but we made space anyways. It's just more people crammed in the back while she stretched out over the front passenger seat. I shared uncomfortable glances with Mike through the rearview mirror along the way. On the way, the sister-in-law had taken a break from her socials to assume control of the stereo, twisting and poking at the machine without any delicacy. Within minutes of her tampering, the folk tunes were replaced by a loud and squeaky upbeat melody that threatened to shatter the windows along with our eardrums. At the forced intervention of her brother, she reluctantly turned it off while we recovered from the shell shock and silence for the rest of the ride. I felt a buzz in my pocket and found a text message from Briony. We exchanged a secret conversation of mutual annoyance and dread with this year's new edition, quietly giggling to ourselves and our antics. An eternity later, we pulled into the lay-by in the national park and began to unload our gear. Myself, Chris, and Briony stretched our soreness and our muscles from being human Tetris pieces for the last hour. I used the last of my cell phone signal to check the weather again, slightly worried about a large distant mass of thick gray clouds, but all reports said none were to be expected. The trek through the park started easy, a casual stroll through the forest that we've done enough times to navigate the path blindfolded. The sister-in-law, on the other hand, found the walk anything but coming up with childish new complaints each time we solved her previous crisis. I asked her why she decided to come with us if all she's going to do is complain, and all that earned was an icy death stare with a smirk, whatever that means. The sister-in-law trailed at the back of the group, stretched her arms in various awkward angles in the frustrated hopes of finding a miraculous cell phone signal. Her connection back to society. When that proved no good, she slumped on the floor and sulked, demanding Chris take her home. He refused, of course, but it still took an hour and a half of valuable daylight before we could get her on her feet again. Only the promise of a better signal higher up seemed to be good enough. Even if we knew her temper would return with a vengeance when she realized it was a lie. Mike and Briony scouted ahead while we were managing the sister-in-law, later directing us through walkie-talkies to a patch of land that would be good for camping. With a well-practiced efficiency, they'd already constructed one tent and were fast at work putting up the other. With what little daylight we had left, Chris and I fumbled with our own tents while sister-in-law searched extensively again for her aloof signal, ignoring questions from Chris. When we were finished, we began to put together a base for a fire as the sister-in-law came back to earth, asking us quite impolitely why we had not put her tent up as well. I gave her a tent bag and a torch and told her to have fun, a remark which sends her into a tirade of slurs and expletives as her temper exploded. I defended myself, although from an outside perspective, it may just look like a heated argument only dying down when we were broken up by Chris and Mike. Chris offered to put the sister-in-law's tent up if she could not, and she would go help Briony go collect some firewood. While she seemed no happier at this idea, I could tell that she considered it a small victory. While I sulked at her always getting her way, I tried to raise my concerns in her absence, but they were shrugged off, so I dismissed it as a family business. When she did return some 10 minutes later, she strolled triumphantly into camp, holding her 3 little twigs while Briony followed behind carrying 30 sticks. She glanced in my direction, but I avoided eye contact as to not give her satisfaction. Instead, she watched as the others piled the wood and started a fire. Sitting down to finally rest for the evening, she strode purposefully over to her backpack and began to pull out small containers, exclaiming with unquestioned authority that she had meals for the group already cooked. We were taken aback by the comment. The same person who's been a pain in the butt all day, complaining about every second of the trip, was now suddenly making us dinner? While my friends accepted the idea, I was a little more skeptical of her intentions. Rightfully so, as I noticed her idea of meal consisted purely of sausages and burgers grilled over the campfire. I've been a practicing vegan for most of my life, and most of my life did revolve around this fact. A fact that my very loving, very thoughtful, very cruel sister-in-law definitely knew. More, it was my turn to storm off after the argument, and I was unpleasantly surprised when no one rushed after me, as Chris, in particular, seemed to have his hands full, restraining the sister-in-law's tantrum from erupting into petty violence. And Mike and Briony sat dumbfounded at the scene. A few minutes later of sitting in the dark, I was joined by Chris, who apologized on her behalf and promised to sort out better meals, hoping to put the grudge to one side for the rest of the weekend. Before we went back, I questioned him again why he always took her side but only got tired signs in response. While this weekend may be tough on me, he had known her for far longer, so it was a behavior he was used to. The next hour was filled with sounds of the crackling fire and chirping insects as we ate our meals in focused silence, sharing only brief knowing glances around the group. The sister-in-law retired shortly after, and she tried to pull a bigger fire because she was cold, but was stopped due to hazards that she tried to ignore anyways. At this point, I was feeling pretty bummed. The weekend we all look forward to each year was being ruined by a person we didn't even want here. The mood around the campfire remained bleak, and everyone retired soon after, leaving me to stare blissfully into the dancing flames. Sometimes later, I felt someone sit next to me, but I didn't stop to check who. I didn't care. Then the voice started to speak. Mike reassured me that he and Briony were of the same mind and were not happier about the trip than I was. Quietly, we discussed our troubles, and I wished for a way to make her disappear. This seemed to flip a switch in his brain as he announced he had a perfect idea for that. A few miles back down the hill was an abandoned cabin in the woods that have been sold to the government under the control of the National Park Authority. I started voicing my doubts at sending anyone into a literal horror movie, but Mike assured me that it was a regular visit by campers or rangers, so it's perfectly safe. It had running water, a bathroom, and probably some emergency rations. There were definitely worse places to be stuck for a day or two. Feeling eased that the sister-in-law would be safe and probably better off than camping, we organized the details of the plan, ready to begin and execute it in the morning. For the sake of the mission, he recommended I not mention it to Chris, who I agree would have definitely stopped the idea on the spot. On the other hand, Briony could be trusted to keep the secrecy, as she had no particular love for sister-in-law either. So, the next morning we wake up and ate our breakfast meals as normal, exchanging small talks and bending to the sister-in-law's request. She may have thought of us being suspiciously subservient, but she accepted that she could now boss us around freely. Chris also seemed slightly confused at our sudden cooperation, but maybe he also thought we were just getting used to it like he had. We packed down the tents and put the campfire ashes out. Chris and I put down her tent as well, of course, while she sat gazing into a hand mirror to carefully apply a moderate layer of makeup. Chris and sister-in-law led the journey, with the rest of the group lagging behind just a little so that we could whisper over our preparations. At camp tonight, Briony was going to leave to, quote, make a call, while sister-in-law prepared meals, so that she would be too busy to follow. Later, she would likely interrogate Briony until she was forced to give up the details, at which point Mike or I, depending on how receptive she is at the first time, would offer to show her where. It was also crucial that Chris was not around to hear this part, else he would know exactly where to look for her in the first operation of Trap the Witch would be over. We were snapped out of focus by almost walking into Chris and sister-in-law, who scolded us when it caused her to stumble and get dirt on her knees, getting up and telling me in a familiar language of animal comparisons. The sister-in-law wanted to stop at camp earlier today, but we stubbornly pressed on, knowing that we first needed to be near the trap. She groaned and moaned and slowed to a zombie's pace, but we did eventually manage to keep her going long enough to reach our destination. After everything was prepared, we gave each other a knowing nod, while sister-in-law starts to dig out meals from her book bag. Briony mumbled aloud to the group and walked into the darkness without much in response. Mike offered to get some firewood and encouraged Chris in joining him with a macho enthusiasm. I sat in silence waiting for Briony's return, the sister-in-law with her back to me. Briony returned and emphasized details about her phone call, which drew her attention like a moth aflames. After some heated encouragement, we told her about the shed. She stood up and suddenly bursted with energy as she demanded one of us to show her this right now. So, I obliged, feigning annoyance of course, and she walked ahead and prodded me for directions by the minute like an obnoxious little parrot. We somehow made it to the cabin before I gave up and bashed her brains in. She rushed to the door and began to pull out the door, but was unable to make it budge by her strength alone, ordering me over to help. Perfect! Just as Mike had described yesterday, the cabin was small, with only one door and a few dirty windows. The door, as it happened, was heavy and difficult to move alone, which only made my means to trap her easier. After we've struggled by our way inside, she pushed past me to go and explore. I grounded my feet, took a deep breath, and I pulled the dear life, carefully but quickly shutting the door behind her. I didn't wait to hear if she heard the door close. I got out of there so fast. So, I walked casually back along the trail while putting together the pieces of my alibi. Should I need one, of course. If questioned, I would stick to the story of the door slammed after sister-in-law went in. I thought she shut me out, so I let her have some private time. Arriving back to the camp, I found Chris and Mike was still out, giving me enough time to put Briony up to speed on the details. Thinking cleverly, she also turned on a small electric lantern in the sister-in-law's tent to pretend it was being occupied. When Chris did inevitably ask her whereabouts, we said that she's got tired and went to bed, not happy to be disturbed. With her finally out of the way, the atmosphere at the camp was lifted, making this year feel like a holiday again instead of a nightmare that it's become. Briony cooked us an assortment of vegetable skewers, baked potatoes, and popcorn roasting on the roaring fire, while Chris and Mike stumbled through somewhat of a drunken duet, in acoustic karaoke. We ate, we drank, we sang, we celebrated our friendship through the tough years we shared together. Whether Chris noticed his sister was absent or not, it did not seem to plague his thoughts, and the night became a great party until we dropped dead in our tent just as the sky was starting to brighten. The sun rose and passed us by quickly the next morning. We all ended up oversleeping until noon, and the sign of a good night, and much-needed rest. Chris woke up last and joined us for breakfast around the former campfire. We ate in silence as we regarded the stunning views around us. Then suddenly, Chris's expression darkened as he stood up and approached his sister's open and empty tent, darting in every direction with growing anxiety. We finished our meals quietly as his panic stirred to the point of a nervous breakdown, unable to quantify her whereabouts. Approaching us, he questioned the group on whether anyone had seen her this morning or the night before, but we each feigned ignorance in turn and proposed our own thoughts on her. When no answers seemed to ease his nerves, I made a small but fake confession. We went for a walk earlier and got into an argument. The sister-in-law got so mad she decided to take her things and tail it back home. After making me show her the way, this seemed to be enough for Chris to believe, whether he was convinced by the fact that we argued or that she would easily give up if she had the chance. I assured him that at the end of the weekend she would be waiting for him, and we were thankfully able to continue enjoying the trip. Hey guys, Mr. Reddito here, so things are about to get absolutely wild. The next few updates are just hours after hours after hours, and guys, I want to tell you right now, this story is about to take a turn for the worst. I hope you guys are having a great day today. If you're not subscribed to the channel, just know it's the best way to support me. And let's get into update number 1, titled 24 Hours Later. Well, it's been 24 hours since the devilish sister-in-law decided to go home in the middle of the weekend hike in the wilderness, an idea that took a lot of convincing to get Chris to believe. But he did. With that darkness behind us, I even managed to forget about her for a while, and it looked like everyone else did too. Even though the occasional nervous or distant expression from Chris suggested it was still plaguing his thoughts, if he had any doubts at the time, he never voiced them. Chris and I opted to go out for firewood on our final night camping. During our walk, I was subject to a game of 20 questions about the sister-in-law, as he tried to understand her decision to leave. Even though she did hate me and the outdoors, while I wanted to be helpful, I steered him as far from the truth as I could, so that he did not catch on to anything odd. While I did not make lying to my partner a habit, I must have been decent at it. As we neared camp, he began to bring up the argument that I've been getting into with her before, wondering whether there was a grudge or a motive at play. But before I could answer, Mike interrupted the conversation and saved me. Chris was the only one that didn't know that she was safely put in timeout, but no one wanted to tell him either. If he knew we'd had intentionally trapped her, he may leave right then and there and possibly making it the last hike we'd ever go on together. Furthermore, releasing her now only so that she can continue ruining our hike was the last thing any of us wanted. After some delicious fireside meals and sufficient wearing down from Briony and Mike, Chris was pulled begrudgingly into party games and terrible karaoke again. The usual tricks, but it seemed like it was enough for now. A few beers and a song later, it was just like old times again, without any nuisance or worries weighing us down. I think this time, we finally had a decent night. Update number 2, 72 hours later. After the weekend, I took some time off from work and tried to make an effort by initially accompanying Chris to the hospital. But while we were there, the sister-in-law made it very clear in very vivid words how unwelcomed my presence was. So, yeah, as you can imagine, I decided to keep my distance. In the meanwhile, I was bombarded with messages in the group chat from others of her condition. The others were probably just as worried as I was. Not worried about her, at least, but worried about what she remembered. In this case, however, it looked like she only had hatred set against me. Mike and Briony had somehow dodged that bullet. While I did not expect her to forget about the weekend so quickly, I was not expecting her to be burning such an intense grudge either. All for the sake of peace, quiet, and maybe a hint of revenge. Even though she became the victim of the past event, I still had not forgotten or forgiven her behavior, her attitude, and her trying to feed me meat. Even if everyone else had seemingly moved on since, I expected that by the end of it, I didn't like her and she didn't like me. But at the end of the day, it was just petty things that I could live with and ignore, like I've done before. Update number 3, 1 week later. The day I dread's finally here. The sister-in-law was released from the hospital late last night after a routine of mandated treatment and surveillance, and of course, with her replenished energy came to the end of my reprieve from stress. She was only in the cabin a few days at most, but I was told about her ordeal by Chris. And the way she told the story, you would have thought that she's been locked in that cabin for months. Like a master manipulator or drama queen, she knew exactly how to embellish it, and exactly what buttons she needed to push in order to maximize the greatest sympathy and awe from the unfortunate few that listened. What I did not know, however, was that her mother had approached the local news station about the events of her behalf. Not the kind of person who would turn down any type of spotlight, huh? The story ran the same night that she was welcomed home, and much to my horror, even that was not the end of it. So, the next morning I returned to work and was bombarded by questions from others, who recognized my sister-in-law in the news, and the rumors spread fast with everyone having different opinions on what happened. I offered no answers to their theories as I had to profess my innocence, although I could see that they would have wished I said more. An uneventful hour passed after the workers fell quietly back into routine. The room I worked in was a compromise of 8 tight cubicles and a receptionist desk along the back wall. From where I sat, I could see the receptionist and the main door, so I was the second to be alarmed to what happens next. A call interrupted the receptionist, and she answered in the same odd expression. Her eyes flickered over and locked briefly onto mine before darting away uncomfortably. She hit the buzzer for the door and stared at her papers. The door pushed open moments later, revealing 2 police officers. They approached the receptionist and muttered something I was too far away to hear, and then made their way towards the cubicles. In a momentary panic, I pulled my gaze away and started working again, assuming they were here for another reason. Please, just any other reason, but they were not, and sister-in-law had indeed sent them finally after me. The 2 men loomed by my desk and began to list me the charges, giving the usual law spiel you'd see on TV, while other employees crowded around us. Pushing through the crowd, they hauled me off shamefully out of the room and into the back of their cruiser. Update number 4, 2 weeks later. In the end, the matter went to trial. 2 weeks after that fated weekend, I was told that she had dropped the case entirely. To this day, I still don't know whether Chris had begged her to do it or she only had to scare me in the first place. After the arrest, I ended up spending most of the night in town jail before a bond could be arranged for my release, prolonged by the sister-in-law who compelled her side of the family to take her side. I later found out that Chris, who had been visiting a family at the time, was not even told I was arrested until he came home this afternoon and was visited by a curious colleague. And when Chris was unable to appeal to the sister-in-law to drop the charges, he was told to leave or choose a side. Well, this practically left him alienated, conflicted, and miserable. Not ready to abandon me or abandon family by his side, he was struck in an awful position. Unable to dip into our savings for the bond, he also resorted to take a small loan after an initial crowdfunding attempt did not go smoothly. I would not necessarily say that getting pulled out by officers by a cop did anything positive for my reputation in town. Well, my colleagues thought it was cool, but my bosses not so much. I was pulled into a meeting with the company's executives on my first day back who grilled me intensely on the matter. I must have either been very lucky or very persuasive, as I left that meeting reassured I could keep my job with a swift warning. So, I drove over to Chris's family home the next morning while he was at work and confronted sister-in-law about the damage that she's done to me and Chris, who was still being given the silent treatment for siding with me over his sister. Instead, the family treated me like a creepy, pushy snake oil salesman, refusing to answer the door as they tried to shoo me off from the window. With my partner's interest at heart, I did my best to push down my feelings, and I begrudgingly apologized to the sister-in-law. I don't know whether or not she actually forgave me, but it was enough that Chris was happy, not feeling like an outsider in his home anymore. Deep down, it still felt like her victory, and maybe that's why the harassment stopped after that. What's up, guys? Mr. Reddito here. So this was a very interesting story. In my opinion, I think OP was very wrong for locking somebody in a cabin, but let me know your thoughts on this. Guys, there's still one final update, update number 5. It came out exactly 1 year later. Here's your final update. A few tough weeks followed my arrest and sister-in-law's dubious threat of court action, all amounting to nothing but a healthy scare and near mental collapse. It was a close call, but I guess I can't beat that easily. It goes without saying that our relationship after that hike had been unstable at best. The uneasy feud between us could be better compared to years of the Cold War, more so than ordinary family drama. But I was not expecting anything to change there, so I tried to not let it get to me. Life carried on and days passed by. Despite everything, though, nothing could dampen our optimism as the seasons flashed by, drawing ever closer to our tradition and renewal. And the sister-in-law, of course, became especially cold to myself and Chris in anticipation of this. But at least she did not get an invite this year. Not that I expected she would come, as even if she did get invited, I can say with safe certainty that her presence over the weekend was not missed in the slightest. Throughout the day, the events of last replayed in my mind like a projector on a loop, reliving the worst moments on repeat. By the time we'd sat down to camp for the first night, I needed help to set up my tent due to my distractions. My friends were worried that they could not shake me from the catatonic state, leaving me to finish their other preparations. I sat somber silent until the delicious aromas of grilled vegetables snapped me out of my haze, and I woke up back in my own body. Fond memories of years past wafted up my nose, filling me with nostalgia and a deep hunger. I wasn't previously aware I was even hungry. The rest of the weekend blasted by too quickly, and we solemnly parted ways again Sunday afternoon, resolving to see each other again next year. Okay guys, look, I want to tell my honest opinion on this story because it kinda made me mad. To be honest, I can completely understand how OP would not want sister-in-law there because, hey, she did drag down the entire environment. But what OP did, I believe, is just inexcusable. She could have really hurt her. She could have starved to death. They didn't know the condition of the cabin or anything. If she was truly stuck in there for 72 hours, just think of the consequences. So no, I do not agree that OP did the right thing. In fact, I really believe OP is the a-hole in this story. And the fact that she was basically a liar too. She was lying to her significant other, not about like cooking or something that doesn't matter. No, about the health of his own sister. And when she ended up in the hospital and still OP was trying to make excuses that she's just being too much or too dramatic, I think it was just too much for me. So in my honest opinion, I say OP, you are the a-hole. But that's okay if you guys don't agree with me. Let me know your thoughts about this one. If you were OP and you were in the same position, would you have done that plan? Or maybe, would you have just confronted her and said, hey, I don't know why you're making our life so miserable. We're trying to have fun at this yearly trip. Can you please just try to get along with us, sing some karaoke, and maybe have fun? But no, OP went the much more drastic route, so all I'm asking from you guys is, let me know in the opinions down below if you think it was too far. Guys, thank you so much for joining me on this story. This was one of my favorite stories to read for quite some time. It was interesting to me. Let me know if you like these type of stories, outdoorsy adventure type. And I hope you guys have an amazing day. I hope to see you tomorrow, and smash that subscribe button. See you guys.